Yeah, somehow a lot of people have this misconception that money can be hoarded and they're billionaires that have piles of gold that they're just rolling around in. And that's not how any of this works.
No, this part of the problem, I think, is twofold, right? The first thing that people just assume, and I don't think they have a whole lot of evidence to warrant the assumption, but they assume that somehow if you have billions of dollars, you got them in some sort of nefarious way.
Yes, you must have taken advantage of someone.
That's right. So that's the first assumption. And then the second assumption is the one you led with, that you're like Scrooge McDuck sitting on a giant pile of gold doubloons in his basement, rolling around in them and having a grand old time. So I think both of these things are completely mistaken. And yet they do form the bedrock understanding that most people have of these things. So let's talk about the first thing first and the second thing second. Where does the money come from?
Now, granted, there are instances in which people get rich because they can co-opt the government to take money from one group of people and hand it to another.
Yeah, we're not talking about that.
No, by and large, people get rich by offering other people things that those people like better than their money. I'll give you a good case in point. Sanders tweeted several weeks ago about how horrible it is that these Wall Street portfolio managers are earning multi-tens of millions of dollars. And I tweeted back, well, the solution's simple. Don't hire them. Go hire somebody else.
And my personal favorite when we talk about this sort of thing, well, I guess I have two. Jeff Bezos is one. If you think Jeff Bezos has too much money, stop buying things on Amazon.
Right.
But the simple fact is that people want to buy things on Amazon. It's convenient. It's inexpensive. It actually works really, really well. Better than any government program, I might point out. But the other example I really like, and I really like it for a lot of very obvious reasons, is Steve Jobs and iPhones, right?
Yeah.
Steve Jobs, I believe, died with $8 billion in his bank account.
About $8 billion, that's right.
I mean, that's a lot of money. And if I were Bernie Sanders, I would point out, well, nobody needs $8 billion, but that would miss the point. He might be right. It may be the case that nobody needs $8 billion, but where did Steve Jobs get it? And the answer is we gave it to him because we all wanted his products more than we wanted our money.
Yes, we voluntarily handed him that money.
It's like we put it in envelopes and put it in the mail and sent it because he got that money through a voluntary transaction, half of which came back to us in the form of products.
Now, people will say things like, well, I need a phone. Okay, well, that's fine, but that doesn't change the fact that you want it. Why do you want it? Well, because I need it. I need it for my business or whatever. But what that means is you're willing to hand over the money because the phone is more valuable to you for whatever reason than the money is in your pocket.
All right, so we've made the voluntary trade and the money goes to him, the stuff comes to us. We very promptly forget that we got something in exchange for the money because if we remembered, we'd look at the bank account and think, well, he earned that. We sent it to him. That was a voluntary thing. But we do forget, and then we say things like, he doesn't need that much of it. Let's take it back. And that's about where it starts to go off the rails.
And part of that, I think, is motivated by your Scrooge McDuck example of people think that somehow billionaires are sitting on, they use the term hoarding this wealth, and that if we took it away from them and gave it to the people would spend it and would get cycled through the economy and that would be better. And the fact is, all of the money that billionaires have, all of their savings is spent. It just isn't spent by them. It's spent by people who borrow it after they put it into the bank or into their investments or what have you. Small businesses borrow it for the purpose of building up physical plants so that they can hire more people and produce more product, which is good for the rest of us. All of that money is spent. It is currently being cycled through the economy as we speak. It just isn't being spent by the billionaires.
All right, so this gets us to, I think, one of our common hobby horses. It really seems to be the case that the only way politicians can start to make the claims that they make with apparent straight faces is that when these people win, we all lose. They have to perceive the economy as a zero-sum game in which every victory has a corresponding loss. And you get this from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who in her Green Deal nonsense. Well, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez makes the case in pursuing that harebrained scheme that we've had wage stagnation for 40 years and that the standard of living has declined over time, which would make sense, right, if some people were gobbling up all the money and other people were left with none.
Right.
but the numbers don't bear out any of those premises.
They don't, and this is a weird sleight of hand that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders also have done multiple times in the past, and that is to point to wage stagnation and say, here's the problem. And the fact is, if you run the numbers, and this is for hourly workers, so salary workers are a different matter. If you run the numbers for hourly workers, it turns out that that's actually approximately correct. Hourly workers today, adjusted for inflation, are earning about the same in terms of their wages as they were in the 1970s. So people say, aha, see, well, there's stagnant wages. And what we're forgetting...
But wait, there's more.
Yeah, because what we're forgetting is what someone receives for working isn't just the wage. It's also the employer-paid benefits. And together you call those things compensation. It's the compensation that matters. And if you look at the compensation, the average hourly employee in this country has a compensation, adjusted for inflation, that's about 50% higher than it was in the 1970s.
If 50% higher is their version of stagnation, I say give us more stagnation.
Right, yeah. But it's important to understand what's going on here. The average hourly employee has a standard of living that's higher than it was in the 1970s, not because they're bringing home more money in their paycheck, but because their employer is providing more benefits in the form of retirement, in the form of health care. Why is that the case? Well, in part it's the case because that's the way the government has designed it. It has designed the tax code to make employee-paid benefits largely tax-free, whereas wages are taxable. So if your employer comes to you and says, hey, James, you can have another $1,000. Do you want it in the form of wages or do you want it in the form of contributions to your health insurance? If you say wages, you just took a 25% haircut on that $1,000.
This actually makes things rather easy on our part, right? Because if you're right, we should be able to look out the window and see people having a much better standard of living now than 40 years ago. If Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders are right, we should look out and see roughly the exact same story we would have seen 40 years ago. So I guess the simple thing to do here then is ask yourself, do you want to go back 40 years or do you think that would be to give something essential up?
Right, and when you think about that, don't make the mistake of saying, well, 40 years ago, this thing or that thing was less expensive. Look at what you have. How many people today have two cars versus in the 1970s, it was very rare. I was a kid then. It was very rare for a family to have two cars. Most of them had one. Go back 40 years earlier, and it would have been very rare for a family to have just one car. Houses today, on average, tend to be larger, more square footage than in the 1970s. You talked about the iPhone. We have these computers in our pockets. I think I've got 3 computers sitting in the household between me and what the kids are using in high school, versus in the 1970s, the only people who had computers were universities and the government.
I have 5 devices in my office right this second as we record that have more computing power than NASA had to send astronauts to the moon.
Yeah. And, that's not to say that there aren't people who are worse off. Clearly, there are people who are worse off. But on average, the typical person is way better off. In fact, if you want to push this to an extreme, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders are correct that exchange is a zero-sum game, that these billionaires sell stuff, they collect this money, and that's all to their benefit and to the loss of the rest of us. If that's the case, then we should all be dirt poor right now.
Oh, no, Ant, I'm going to go one step better than that. If that's the case, we should all still be living in caves.
Right, because currently those 550 billionaires are sitting on as much purchasing power as the entire planet owned 200 years ago.
And it's interesting, right, because we've got about 550 billionaires, and we've got 535 representatives and senators sitting in Washington, D.C. And if you fear the billionaires but don't fear the congressmen, you're out of your mind.
Well, that's an interesting point, James. So roughly speaking, that's the same numbers, 550 billionaires, 550 some odd, I guess 535 representatives and senators. Those billionaires, their wealth, that's the total amount of money they're sitting on, roughly speaking about $2.5 trillion. Those representatives and senators, they control spending to the tune of about $4 trillion every single year. In terms of economic power, those 535 representatives and senators dwarf the billionaires.
But here's the kicker, right? The billionaires get their money through voluntary exchange and transactions. Politicians, senators, representatives, They get your money by putting a gun to your head and taking it.
Yeah.
What more do you really need to know? Why on earth would you trust the people who will confiscate your money and not trust the people who you give it to voluntarily? And that's baffling. It's absolutely baffling. And I think it goes back to the money problem. People not understanding what money is and what transactions are and how wealth is created.